The scent of expensive cedar and drafting ink was usually the only thing that occupied my senses at this hour, a professional perfume that signaled the end of a disciplined day. As an architectural consultant, these midnight walkthroughs of the Latte Super Tower were my sanctuary, a silent world of skeletal steel and blueprints where the city's chaos couldn't reach me. I was tracing the line of a load-bearing column on the 48th floor when the first sound cut through the sterile quiet. It wasn't loud. It was a muffled thud, like a heavy roll of carpet falling from a great height. I froze, my fingers trailing off the cold concrete. Security here was legendary, a fortress of biometric locks and patrolling guards, but my heart, now a frantic bird in my chest, didn't care about the building's reputation. I told myself it was just the wind whistling through the unfinished glass casings. It was always nothing. But then came the second sound, a low, guttural command in a dialect of Korean that sounded sharper, more lethal, followed by a sickeningly wet crack. I didn't hesitate. I dropped my tablet, its clatter unnaturally loud in the hollow space, and ducked behind a stack of mahogany crates, my breath catching in my throat. The service elevator at the far end of the floor chimed. The door slid open with a harsh metallic clang, and 3 men spilled out. They were not night shift workers. Their suits were too sharp, their shoulders too broad, and the predatory grace with which they moved suggested the bulges beneath their jackets were not wallets. They dragged a 4th man between them, his expensive Italian loafers scuffing trails of dark, visceral red across my pristine floor. They forced him to his knees before the open ledge that overlooked the glittering, indifferent heart of Seoul. The man was begging, his voice thick with a terror that transcended language. I pressed myself smaller against the rough wood of the crates, praying to be invisible, praying to be nothing. Then he stepped out of the shadows. Calm Min-jae didn't look like a monster. He looked like a monument. He was rigid and composed in a tailored black suit, his jet black hair styled back to reveal a jawline that seemed carved from the very stone of the building. He didn't smile. Power had clearly never required it of him. As he looked down at the man on the floor, his eyes remained dark and intense, fixed with a quiet threat that made the air feel heavy. "Love is weakness," he said, his voice a low, melodic silk that carried over the wind. "And your love for your brother has made you very weak indeed." The leader pulled a gun. In that moment, the wind shifted, blowing my scent toward them. Min-jae's head turned with the precision of a predator. His cold gaze found mine behind the crates, and in that instant, the life I knew ended. My new life, a dangerous, gilded vow, was about to begin. The silence that followed the gunshot was more deafening than the blast itself. The man who had been begging was now nothing more than a slumped shadow against the Seoul skyline, his blood seeping into the concrete grooves I had surveyed only hours before. I remained paralyzed behind the cedar crates, my lungs burning as I fought the urge to gasp for air. I wanted to be invisible, to be a ghost in the machinery of this half-finished tower, but the man in the tailored black suit was already moving. Min-jae did not run. He walked with a deliberate, authoritative grace, his leather shoes clicking rhythmically against the floor like the ticking of a countdown clock. His men fanned out, their sharp silhouettes cutting through the shadows with predatory precision. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing my forehead against the rough wood, but the scent of his expensive sandalwood incense reached me before his shadow did. The problem with hiding, Min-jae's voice drifted over the crates, low and unreadable, is that you eventually have to breathe. One of his associates kicked the crate aside. The sudden exposure felt like a physical blow. I looked up, my gaze traveling from his polished shoes to the sharp, disciplined jawline that seemed carved from cold stone. He stood rigid and composed, a man who had never needed to smile because power had granted him everything else. His eyes were dark and intense, fixing on me with a quiet threat that made the very air in the room feel heavy and thin. I didn't scream. My power had always been quiet, rooted in a serene resolution that had carried me across oceans to this city. I met his gaze, my back straightening even as I knelt on the cold floor. I saw the flicker of something in his expression, not pity, but a momentary curiosity at the woman in the elegant dress who refused to tremble. "You are Naomi Carter," he stated, his voice a melodic silk that lacked any trace of warmth. He didn't ask. A man like him already knew the names of the ghosts in his house. He looked at the blood on the floor, then back at my unyielding eyes. You have seen a truth that ends lives, Naomi. In my world, love is a weakness that gets men killed, and witnesses are liabilities that must be liquidated. He stepped closer, the candlelight from a nearby work lamp casting golden highlights across his unreadable face. He looked like a monument to violence, yet there was a magnetic pull to his stillness. He reached out, his gloved fingers hovering just inches from my chin, daring me to flinch. I stayed as still as the steel beams surrounding us. However, he continued, his gaze narrowing, I find myself in need of a different kind of asset. One with your poise. One who can stand beside me and look the world in the eye without blinking. The life I had meticulously built was gone, replaced by the cold, dark romance of a dangerous devotion I was only beginning to understand. The heavy, metallic scent of the execution still hung in the air, but the man standing before me seemed entirely untouched by the carnage. Min Jae's gloved hand finally tilted my chin upward, forcing me to look into the dark, intense eyes of a man accustomed to command. The silence of the construction site was absolute, save for the distant, indifferent hum of the city below. You have two paths tonight, Naomi Carter, he began, his voice a low, melodic silk that felt like a tether tightening around my throat. The first ends here, on this floor, where you become another secret buried in the foundation of this tower. He didn't say it with malice. He said it with the cold, logical detachment of a man removing a structural flaw. I didn't pull away. I kept my gaze serene and resolute, my own quiet power meeting his authoritative chill. And the second path? I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. A ghost of a shadow crossed his sharp cheekbones. The second is a contract, a strategic alliance disguised as a dangerous vow. He stepped back, his silhouette framing him against the flickering candlelight of the work lamps like a witness to a grim ceremony. My advisors require a social front, a wife who possesses poise, intelligence, and a lack of inconvenient sentiment. You require a reason for me to keep you alive. The ultimatum was as sharp and disciplined as his jawline. He was offering me a gilded shroud, a marriage born not of innocence or love, but of fate and necessity. In his world, love was a weakness, a creed he intended to maintain by making our union nothing more than a tactical acquisition. You want me to be an asset, I whispered, the word tasting like ash. I want you to be a shield, he corrected, his expression unreadable and cold. Become the bride of the Kong Syndicate, and you'll be the only person in this city I am forbidden to kill. Refuse, and you remain a liability. I looked at the blood on the floor, then at the man who held the world in a quiet threat. To survive, I would have to step into the darkness beside him, trading my freedom for a sheer veil and a jeweled headpiece that would hide the fear in my eyes. I will take the altar, I said, my voice echoing through the hollow steel. Min Jae didn't smile. Power had never required it. He simply nodded to his men. Then the performance begins. Prepare the ceremony. We have a wedding to attend. The air in the private hall was thick with the scent of beeswax and old stone, a heavy, silent atmosphere that felt more like a funeral than a beginning. Tall, glowing candle flames lined the aisle, their flickering tongues framing us like witnesses to a dangerous vow. There were no flowers, no soft music, only the rhythmic, intimidating echo of our footsteps on the polished marble. I stood in an elegant white wedding gown, the delicate lace embroidery feeling like armor against my skin. A sheer veil fell behind me, crowned with a subtle jeweled headpiece that caught the candlelight, hiding the frantic pulse at my throat. Beside me, Kong Min Jae was a study in rigid, unsmiling composure. His tailored black suit was minimal and authoritative, a sharp contrast to the soft white silk of my dress. He didn't look at me as we stood before the officiant. His dark, intense eyes were fixed forward with a quiet threat, as if daring the shadows of the chapel to challenge his latest acquisition. This was not a union of hearts, but a cold, strategic contract designed to turn a witness into a permanent asset. To the men standing in the shadows, Min Jae's lieutenants and board members, this was a corporate merger sealed in blood and silk. As we exchanged the rings, Min-jae's fingers were steady and ice-cold. There was no warmth in his touch, only the firm grip of a man accustomed to command and violence. When he spoke his vase, the words were a melodic silk that lacked any trace of affection. He was promising protection, not love. I was promising silence, not devotion. The overall mood was one of forbidden union and dangerous devotion, a marriage born of strategy in a world that viewed love as a fatal flaw. The candles cast warm golden light that danced across my radiant skin, but the warmth was an illusion. In the reflection of the dark glass windows, we looked like a regal, powerful couple, but I knew the truth. I was a liability, wrapped in lace, and he was the monument who had claimed me to satisfy his own cold logic. As the ceremony ended, Min-jae finally turned his head. His expression remained unreadable, his sharp cheekbones and disciplined jawline illuminated by the dying flames. "You are now a Kong," he whispered, the words barely audible over the crackle of the wicks. "Do not mistake this gold for a gift. It is a tether." I met his gaze with a serene but resolute expression. I was fully aware of the danger I had married into, but as I looked into his dark eyes, I realized that while he saw me as a strategic shield, I was beginning to see the man trapped inside the fortress of his own making. The gilded union was complete, and as we walked out of the hall together, I knew my life would never belong to me again. The gates of the Kong estate groaned shut behind us with a finality that echoed the slamming of a vault. If the wedding hall had been a funeral, this mansion was the tomb, a sprawling expanse of glass, black marble, and silence, so heavy it felt intentional. As I stepped into the foyer, my lace train hissed against the polished floor, the only sound in a house that seemed to hold its breath. Min-jae did not offer me his hand. He simply walked forward, his back a rigid, black silhouette against the stark white walls. His world was a masterclass in minimal, authoritative control. There were no photographs on the mantels, no stray books on the tables, and certainly no warmth in the air. Every piece of furniture was placed with surgical precision, designed for utility rather than comfort. It was a fortress of discipline where even the shadows seemed to obey his command. Min-jae stopped in the center of a vast, hollow living room and turned, his dark and intense eyes scanning me as if checking for a flaw in a new piece of hardware. "This is your perimeter," he said, his voice a melodic silk that cut through the silence. "You have the freedom of the grounds, but the gates do not open for you without my clearance. My staff will provide whatever you need, but they answer only to me. You are a Kong now, and in this house, the only rule is absolute discretion." He walked toward a wall of floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the darkened city, his sharp cheekbones caught in the moonlight. "You will attend the functions I deem necessary. You will play the part of the devoted bride. But when the doors are closed, we are strangers bound by a ledger." I stood my ground, my serene but resolute expression reflecting in the glass beside him. The lace of my dress felt suffocatingly heavy, a gilded shroud that marked me as a prisoner in a palace. I realized then that Min-jae didn't just live in this fortress. He was the fortress. He had built a life devoid of inconvenient sentiment, a world where love was a weakness to be purged. "And if I find the silence too loud, Min-jae?" I asked, my voice steady despite the quiet threat that permeated the room. He didn't turn around. His reflection remained unreadable, a monument of cold stone. "Then learn to appreciate the safety of it, Naomi. In my world, the loud ones are the first to be buried." He left me there, a solitary figure in white standing amidst his black and gray empire. As I navigated the winding, sterile corridors to the room that was now mine, I began to notice the contradictions, the way the security cameras followed my every move, and the way the guards bowed not out of respect, but out of fear. I was an asset in a gilded cage, and the rules of the stronghold were clear. Survival meant becoming as cold and disciplined as the man who owned the keys. Days turned into a rhythmic, chilling test of endurance within the marble walls of the estate. I had expected a monster who delighted in cruelty, but instead, I found a man who lived with the surgical precision of a clock. Min-jae was a ghost in his own home, appearing in doorways like a silent omen, his jet-black hair always perfectly styled back, his tailored suits never showing a single crease. He was a man of deliberate, unreadable expressions, someone who did not smile because power had never required it of him. I began to watch him, not as a prisoner watches a guard, but as an architect studies a fortress for its hidden flaws. One evening, I found him in the library, the only room that smelled of something other than sterile lemon. It smelled of aged paper and the same sandalwood incense that had clung to him on the night we met. He didn't notice me at first. He was staring at a small, tarnished silver frame tucked away on the highest shelf, far from the reach of casual eyes. His rigid composure seemed to fray at the edges, his dark and intense eyes softening into something that looked dangerously like grief. "That is a heavy burden to carry in secret," I said softly, my voice a serene contrast to the heavy silence of the room. He snapped the frame face down instantly, his jawline sharpening into a disciplined, defensive edge. The quiet threat returned to his gaze, a cold barrier that dared the world to challenge his authority. "In this house, Naomi, secrets are the only things that keep us grounded," he replied, his voice a melodic silk that lacked its usual bite. I walked toward him, my quiet, emotional power rooted deep as I refused to flinch from his intensity. I realized then that his creed, that love is weakness, wasn't a philosophy he enjoyed. It was a cage he had built to survive a world of violence and secrecy. Behind the minimal, authoritative mask was a man who had sacrificed his heartbeat to become a monument of stone. He watched me with an unyielding gaze, his sharp cheekbones caught in the dim amber light of the library. For the first time, the air between us didn't just feel heavy with danger. It felt electric with a shared, unspoken weight. I saw the invisible scars he refused to name, and in that moment, the monument began to look human. "You think you are protecting yourself by being hollow," I whispered, stepping into the circle of his shadow. "I am protecting the Empire," he corrected, though his hand lingered a second too long near mine on the mahogany table. The contract was still in place, but the strangers bound by it were starting to see past the gilded shroud. The walls of the estate had begun to feel less like a sanctuary and more like a sensory deprivation chamber. Every morning, the same silent staff laid out the same monochromatic silk dresses, and every evening, I was expected to sit at the far end of a mahogany table that felt like a canyon between me and the man I had married. Min-jae remained a monument of cold stone, his presence a quiet threat that demanded I stay in the shadowed background of his life. But I had not survived a life of architectural precision and the brutal night at the construction site to become a piece of still life in a mobster's gallery. The rebellion didn't start with a scream. It started with a seat. Instead of taking my place at the designated end of the table, I walked to the head of it, pulling out the chair directly to Min-jae's right. The silver clink of his fork stopped instantly. He sat rigid and composed, his jet-black hair catching the dim amber light as he slowly turned his unyielding gaze toward me. The air in the room grew heavy, the kind of pressurized silence that precedes a storm. "That is not your place, Naomi," he said, his voice a melodic silk that carried a razor-sharp edge. "I am not a ghost in this house, Min-jae," I replied, my voice serene but resolute. I met his dark and intense eyes, refusing to blink, refusing to be the liability he tucked away in a gilded cage. "You married a partner, or, at the very least, a witness with a pulse. I will not sit where you can ignore me just to maintain your illusion of control." His jawline, already a disciplined edge, tightened further. He looked at me as if truly seeing the woman behind the lace for the first time, a woman fully aware of the danger and unafraid. For a heartbeat, the quiet threat in his eyes flickered, replaced by a spark of something that wasn't anger, but a begrudging recognition of strength. "You are testing the limits of your tether," he warned, leaning in until the scent of his sandalwood incense clouded my senses. "I am defining my space," I corrected, my quiet power rooted deep. "If love is a weakness, then surely treating your wife like a shadow is a strategic error. You lose the perspective of the only person who can see what you're hiding." Min-jae didn't answer immediately. He stared at me with an unyielding gaze that felt like a physical weight. Finally, he signaled the staff to move the settings. He didn't smile. Power had never required it, but the monument had shifted. I was no longer a shadowed background. I was a presence he could no longer overlook. The black sedan moved through the winding coastal roads of Jeju Island with a predatory silence, the engine barely a whisper against the crashing of the waves below. Beside me, Min-jae remained a monument of cold stone, his dark and intense eyes fixed on the horizon, as if he could detect the shifting tides of the underworld even here. We were departing for a secluded estate, a sanctuary of glass and basalt intended for a strategic honeymoon, a public performance of devotion designed to mask the hidden agendas and blood-stained contracts that bound us. The estate was an architectural marvel of isolation, perched on the edge of a jagged cliff where the wind howled with a quiet threat. As we stepped out into the salt-heavy air, Min-jae's hand found the small of my back, a gesture that would look like affection to any watching lens, but felt like the firm grip of a man maintaining his perimeter. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of sea spray and the expensive sandalwood that always heralded his presence. "The Kim clan is watching this island," he murmured, his voice a melodic silk that barely rose above the roar of the ocean. "For the next 7 days, we are not strangers. We are a man and a woman who cannot bear to be apart. Every look, every touch, is a tactical move in a game you cannot afford to lose." I adjusted the sheer veil of my silk wrap, my serene but resolute expression reflecting in the dark glass of the villa's entrance. I was fully aware of the danger we had brought to this paradise. Inside, the minimal and authoritative decor mirrored the mansion in Seoul, a gilded cage redesigned for a smaller, more intimate stage. As the sun dipped below the water, casting a warm golden light that danced across the room's sharp edges, Min-jae poured 2 glasses of dark wine. He stood rigid and composed, his jet-black hair slightly ruffled by the coastal breeze, a human detail that made the monster feel dangerously real. He handed me a glass, his fingers brushing mine with a deliberate, lingering heat that wasn't in the contract. "To the facade," I whispered, my quiet power meeting his unyielding gaze. "To survival," he corrected, his jawline sharpening as he looked toward the shadows of the tree line. In this secluded paradise, the lines between the performance and the truth were beginning to blur, and for the first time, I realized that love wasn't the only thing that could be a weakness. The storm that had been brewing over the Jeju coast finally broke, lashing the glass walls of the villa with a violence that mirrored the world we had left behind. Min-jae stood by the fireplace, the orange glow of the embers carving deep, rhythmic shadows across his sharp cheekbones and disciplined jawline. He was a monument of stillness amidst the howling wind, his jet-black hair slightly disheveled, making him look less like a distant god and more like a man bracing for impact. He did not turn when I entered the room, yet he knew I was there. His awareness was a quiet threat that never truly slept. On the low mahogany table between us sat a small, velvet-lined box. Its presence was minimal and authoritative, a dark blot against the polished wood. "The performance of a honeymoon is a shield that only works as long as the audience is fooled," he began, his voice a melodic silk that carried over the thunder. "But shields can break." He finally turned, his dark and intense eyes searching mine with a scrutiny that felt like a physical weight. "I have watched you, Naomi. You do not tremble in the dark. You have a quiet, deep-rooted power that I did not account for in our initial contract." He gestured toward the box. I walked forward, my silk robes hissing against the floor, and opened it. Resting inside was a compact, matte black handgun, its surface cold and unreflective. It was a gift of steel, a brutal contradiction to the elegant white lace and jeweled headpieces of our wedding day. "In my world, love is a weakness, but helplessness is a sin," Min-jae said, stepping into the circle of my space until the scent of sandalwood and salt air clouded my senses. "I gave you a name to protect you, but a name cannot stop a bullet. This can." I reached out, my fingers brushing the cold metal. I didn't recoil. My expression remained serene but resolute. I looked up at him, realizing that this was the highest form of respect a man like Min-jae could offer. He wasn't just giving me a weapon. He was acknowledging me as a partner in the dangerous devotion that now defined our lives. "You are no longer just a witness, Naomi," he whispered, his unyielding gaze softening for a fraction of a second. "You are a participant." As I lifted the steel, the weight of it felt grounding. The monument had finally handed me a key to the fortress, and for the first time, the dangerous vow we had taken felt like it belonged to both of us. The storm transitioned from a distant roar to a violent siege, the rain lashing the villa's glass walls with such force it sounded like 1,000 frantic fingers trying to claw their way inside. The warm golden light of the foyer flickered and died as the power was cut, plunging the minimal, authoritative interior into a suffocating darkness. Beside me, Min-jae's presence was a quiet threat that had finally found its target. He moved with the predatory grace of a man who had been expecting the shadows to bleed, his hand finding the grip of his weapon with a disciplined, unreadable ease. "Stay low, Naomi," he commanded, his voice a melodic silk that remained eerily calm even as the first window shattered in the kitchen. The scent of gunpowder and sea salt replaced the sandalwood incense as the rival syndicate moved through the perimeter. My wedding gown, an elegant white lace that had once symbolized a strategic contract, now felt like a target painted against the dark. I reached for the cold, matte black handgun Min-jae had given me, the gift of steel, now feeling heavy and real in my hand. I was fully aware of the danger, but as I pressed my back against the black marble pillar, my expression remained serene and resolute. The villa became a labyrinth of flashes and thunder. Every muffled thud of a suppressor was answered by the sickeningly wet crack of glass or the heavy thud of a body hitting the floor. Min-jae was a monument of violence, his sharp cheekbones illuminated by the muzzle flashes as he cleared the hall with authoritative precision. But the rivals were not executives. Their movements were sharp and predatory, and they were closing the distance. I saw a shadow detach itself from the balcony, a blade catching the dim moonlight as it swung toward Min-jae's exposed side. My quiet, deep-rooted power didn't wait for permission. I stepped out of the shadows, the lace of my sleeves fluttering like a ghost's wings as I leveled the barrel. The recoil jarred my shoulder, but I didn't flinch. The man collapsed into the basalt floor, his scuffing trails of red staining the pristine stone. Min-jae turned, his dark and intense eyes meeting mine through the haze of smoke. For a heartbeat, the quiet threat in his gaze was replaced by a profound, unmasking shock. He saw the woman he had married not as a liability to be managed, but as a dangerous devotion that was now keeping him alive. The contract was dead. The war had just begun. The smell of gunpowder hung heavy and bitter in the humid air, clashing with the salt of the sea as the storm continued its relentless assault on the glass. Min-jae leaned heavily against the basalt kitchen island, his tailored black suit torn and darkening with a fluid that was too thick to be rain. His rigid and composed stature had finally cracked. A jagged piece of shrapnel had found its mark in his side, and his breath came in shallow, ragged hitches. "Leave me, Naomi," he rasped, his voice no longer a melodic silk but a fractured whisper of the man he was. "Go to the safe room. I am a liability now." I didn't move. My expression remained serene but resolute as I stepped over the shattered remains of a crystal decanter. I wasn't the frightened girl he had met at the construction site. I was a woman fully aware of the danger and entirely unafraid. My quiet, deep-rooted power had replaced the fear that once lived in my chest. "You told me love was a weakness, Min-jae," I said, my voice steady even as the sound of heavy boots echoed from the hallway. "But weakness wouldn't stay here to save you. Only strength does that." I didn't wait for his permission. I used the architectural knowledge of the estate I had studied to my advantage, realizing the kitchen's heavy steel shutters could be manually overridden. As 3 assassins burst into the room with predatory sharp movements, I didn't flinch. I dropped the matte black handgun into a tactical position, the gift of steel, feeling like a natural extension of my arm. I fired with a discipline that mirrored his own, the muzzle flashes illuminating my white lace gown in brief, ghostly strobes of light. 2 men fell to the polished floor, their blood-scuffing trails across the pristine stone. I grabbed the heavy marble mortar from the counter and slammed the override switch, the steel shutters crashing down with an authoritative thud that sealed us inside and the remaining threat out. The silence that followed was thick with the scent of copper and gunpowder. I knelt beside Min-jae, tearing a strip of silk from my bridal veil to bind his wound with a serene resolution. He looked at me then, his dark and intense eyes wide with a profound, unmasking shock. For the first time, the quiet threat was gone, replaced by the realization that the woman he had married for strategy was the only thing standing between him and the grave. "You saved me," he whispered, his hand trembling as it brushed the lace of my sleeve. "I am your partner, Min-jae," I replied, meeting his unyielding gaze with a power that was no longer quiet. "And today, love is the only thing that made us strong." The adrenaline that had sustained us during the siege began to ebb, leaving behind a cold, trembling hollow in the air of the shuttered kitchen. Min-jae lay back against the basalt island, his face pale, the sharp cheekbones and disciplined jawline softened by the sheer exhaustion of blood loss. I sat beside him, my white lace gown now a map of dark stains, my hands still steady as I tightened the silk tourniquet I'd fashioned from my veil. The storm outside had slowed to a rhythmic weeping against the steel shutters, mirroring the heavy, pressurized silence between us. "You should have left," he murmured, his dark and intense eyes fixed on the ceiling as if he could see the ghosts of his past etched into the architecture. "I was prepared for the grave, Naomi. I was never prepared for you." "Why, Min-jae?" I asked, my voice a serene but resolute contrast to the violence we had just survived. "Why build a world where you are the only one not allowed to feel?" He closed his eyes, and for a moment, the monument of cold stone truly shattered. "Because love is a liability that gets men killed," he whispered, the melodic silk of his voice finally breaking. "My father taught me that. He used my mother's devotion to destroy her, then he used my sister's love to test my loyalty. I watched them both break, because they had a heartbeat. I decided I wouldn't have 1 inch. He turned his head to look at me, his unyielding gaze now vulnerable and stripped of its quiet threat. "The mantra wasn't a law, Naomi. It was a fortress. If I didn't love, nothing could be taken from me. But tonight, watching you stand in that doorway, I realized that my silence didn't protect me. It just made me a ghost." I reached out, my fingers brushing his temple where a stray lock of jet black hair had fallen. "You aren't a ghost anymore," I said softly, my quiet power rooting us both in the present. He caught my hand, his grip no longer ice-cold but feverish and desperate. He pressed my palm to the center of his chest, beneath the torn fabric of his suit. Beneath the layers of authoritative discipline and the weight of the Kong Syndicate, I felt it. A heartbeat, rapid and undeniable. "You were supposed to be an asset," he choked out, the realization shattering his final defense. "But you've become the only thing I cannot survive without." In the dim, smoke-filled room, the dangerous vow had transformed. The contract was no longer written in ink, but in the beat of a heart that had finally learned how to ache. The return to Seoul was not a retreat, but a coronation. The Kong Syndicate headquarters loomed over the city, a monolith of glass and steel that once represented Min-jae's absolute, solitary control. But as the elevator ascended to the executive floor, the man standing beside me was no longer a monument of cold stone. He stood rigid and composed, his jet black hair styled back with authoritative precision, but his hand remained firmly laced with mine, a public declaration that shattered his long-held creed. The boardroom doors swung open, revealing the syndicate's directors, men who lived by the language of violence and viewed love as a fatal flaw. They expected to see a boss who had purged a liability. Instead, they saw a new dynasty. I walked at Min-jae's side, my expression serene but resolute, the white silk of my suit a sharp, regal contrast to the shadows of the room. I was no longer a witness or a shadowed background. I was the strategist who had held the line when the world turned to gunpowder and lace. Min-jae took his seat at the head of the table, but he did not speak until I had taken the chair directly beside him. His dark and intense eyes scanned the room with a quiet threat that was now sharpened by a new, dangerous devotion. "The creed that love is weakness has been the foundation of this house for too long," Min-jae began, his voice a melodic silk that commanded absolute silence. "I have learned that a man who has nothing to lose is merely a ghost. But a man who fights for his heart is unstoppable." He looked at me, and for a heartbeat, the unsmiling power softened into a look of profound partnership. He didn't need to smile. His loyalty was written in the way he deferred to my counsel as we began to dismantle the old, bloody contracts of his father's era. We ruled the empire as equals, using my quiet, deep-rooted power and his authoritative discipline to forge a regime that was built on more than just fear. As the sun set over Seoul, casting a warm golden light across the glittering heart of the city, we stood together by the floor-to-ceiling windows. The dangerous vow we had taken in a dim chapel was now a living reality. Love hadn't made him weak, it had made him a king, and together, we proved that the most powerful force in their violent world was the one they had dared to despise. From the shadows of fear and the weight of danger, we learned a truth that the